Get on the ground, now." The command cut through the afternoon air like a blade, sharp and absolute. The kind of voice people instinctively obey without question, the kind that carries the weight of a badge and years of unchecked authority. And for a brief second, everything seemed to slow down as Ava Carter felt the rough texture of the pavement press against her palms, the warmth of the sun still clinging to the concrete beneath her, the distant hum of traffic fading into a dull echo as a small crowd began to gather. Just a few feet away, their footsteps hesitant, their whispers already forming stories that would spread long before the truth ever had a chance to catch up. And somewhere in that moment, as her breath steadied and her heartbeat refused to race, she didn't resist, she didn't argue, she didn't even look up right away because she had learned something a long time ago. Sometimes the loudest power is the one that says nothing at all. And Officer Daniel Hayes mistook that silence for submission as he stood over her, posture rigid, eyes scanning her like he had already made his decision before a single word had been exchanged, before context, before truth, before anything that might have required him to question his own instincts. And if you were standing there, just 10 feet away, watching it unfold through the lens of your phone, you might have thought the same thing everyone else did, that this was just another routine stop, another moment that would come and go without consequence. Another face in a long line of faces that never quite fit where they were told they didn't belong. Because that's how it always looks in the beginning, ordinary, predictable, almost forgettable, until it isn't, until one small detail shifts everything, until the person on the ground isn't who they appear to be, and the person giving orders realizes far too late that the situation was never under their control to begin with. But Daniel didn't see any of that. Not yet. His focus locked in, his voice steady with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to second-guess himself. "Hands where I can see them," he added, as if the scene needed more authority layered on top of it, as if the tension already building in the air wasn't thick enough to feel. And Ava slowly lifted her hands, deliberate, controlled, every movement measured not out of fear but out of precision, the kind that comes from experience, from training, from understanding exactly how quickly a moment like this can spiral if you let emotion take the lead. And still, she said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew something Daniel didn't. This moment wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the middle of something much bigger, something already in motion long before. He stepped into it, and as the sound of a car door closing echoed faintly in the distance, barely noticeable beneath the murmurs of the crowd, the first crack in the illusion of control had already begun to form, even if no one there, not the onlookers, not the cameras, and certainly not Officer Hayes, had any idea just how quickly everything was about to change. The heat of the afternoon lingered in the air, pressing down on the sidewalk as if the city itself was holding its breath, and from where she lay, Ava Carter could see only fragments of the world around her, shoes shifting nervously, shadows stretching across the pavement, the faint reflection of sunlight bouncing off passing car windows, small, ordinary details that most people would ignore, but to her, every movement mattered, every sound carried weight, because this was not chaos, this was a pattern, and patterns always led somewhere. "Stay still," Daniel Hayes repeated, his tone sharper now, not louder, but edged with something else, something closer to impatience than control, as if the situation was not unfolding the way he expected, as if her calm was disrupting the script he had already written in his mind. And if you listened closely, you could hear it in the way his boots shifted against the pavement, not quite steady, not quite uncertain, just enough to reveal that something about this felt off, though he could not yet explain why. And Ava finally lifted her gaze, slow and deliberate, meeting his eyes for the first time, not with defiance, not with fear, but with a quiet steadiness that made the noise of the crowd fade even further into the background. "Officer," she said, her voice even, controlled, the kind of voice that does not rush because it does not need to. "You are making a mistake." And the words hung there for a moment, suspended between them, simple and direct, but carrying a weight that most people would miss. And Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, shaking his head slightly as if he had heard the same line too many times before. "That is what they all say," he replied, dismissing it without hesitation, because in his world, mistakes were something other people made, not him, not someone who had spent years trusting his instincts. acting on them, being rewarded for them, and around them, the crowd shifted again, phones rising a little higher now, capturing angles, capturing expressions, capturing a story that was already being decided in real time, a woman on the ground, an officer in control, a narrative that felt familiar enough to believe without question, and somewhere behind that circle of onlookers, a black sedan sat parked just beyond the curb, its engine quiet, its presence subtle enough to be overlooked, except by the one person who had already noticed it. Ava's eyes flicked toward it for just a fraction of a second, so quick it could have been nothing, a reflex, a distraction, but it was not, because she knew exactly who was inside, and more importantly, they knew exactly what was happening out here. I need you to listen carefully, she continued, her tone unchanged, still calm, still measured, as if she were speaking in a room far quieter than this one. You are interfering with something you do not understand. And this time, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a shift, subtle but real, in the air between them, the kind that does not announce itself but makes everything feel slightly different. And Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not because he believed her, but because something about the way she said it did not fit the pattern he expected, and for a moment, just a moment, doubt brushed against the edge of his certainty, only to be pushed aside as quickly as it came, because certainty was easier, certainty was familiar, and he stepped back half an inch, adjusting his stance, reasserting control in the only way he knew how. You do not get to tell me how to do my job, he said, and yet, even as the words left his mouth, the faint sound of a door opening somewhere behind the crowd slipped into the scene, quiet but distinct, like the first note of something about to unfold. And if anyone had turned to look at that exact second, they might have seen the shift begin, not in the officer, not in the crowd, but in the story itself, as it slowly, quietly, started to move in a direction none of them were prepared for. The sound of that door did not echo loudly, but it carried, slipping through the edges of conversation and cutting into the rhythm of the moment in a way that made a few heads in the crowd turn without fully understanding why. And Ava heard it clearly, not because it was loud, but because she had been waiting for it, because timing was never accidental in her world, and as she slowly shifted her weight against the pavement, her expression remained unchanged, calm, steady, almost detached, as if she were observing the scene rather than being at the center of it. And for the first time, Daniel Hayes noticed something he could not immediately explain, not in her words, not in her posture, but in the absence of urgency, the absence of fear that he had come to expect in moments like this, and it unsettled him in a way that did not show on his face but revealed itself in the tightening of his grip on control. Do not move, he repeated, though she had not moved at all, though there was no reason to repeat it except to reassure himself that he still held the authority he believed he did. And around them, the energy of the crowd began to shift ever so slightly, the murmurs softening, curiosity turning into something more focused, more attentive, as if people were beginning to sense that this was no longer just another routine encounter. And somewhere behind the outer edge of the gathering, two men in dark suits stepped forward with measured precision, not rushing, not drawing attention, but moving with a purpose that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of everyone else present. And Ava's eyes flicked upward again, this time not toward the car, but toward the subtle reflection of movement in a nearby storefront window, confirming what she already knew, that the situation had reached the point where silence would no longer be enough. And she inhaled slowly, controlled, before speaking again. Her voice just as even as before. Officer Hayes, she said, using his name without hesitation, without asking. And that was the moment something truly shifted, because names carry weight, and the way she said it was not a guess, it was not a question, it was certainty, and Daniel's expression hardened, not in anger, but in confusion masked as authority. How do you know my name? He asked, the words coming out sharper than he intended, and for a fraction of a second, the balance tilted, just slightly, just enough for doubt to find its way back in, and Ava held his gaze, unblinking, her voice lowering just enough to separate her words from the noise around them. Because you stepped into something that was already in motion, she replied, and before he could respond, before he could reclaim the ground he felt slipping beneath him, One of the suited men spoke from just behind the line of onlookers, his tone calm, but unmistakably firm. "That is enough." And the words did not need to be loud to command attention. They carried a different kind of authority, one that did not rely on volume or force, and the crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something official, something structured, something far beyond the moment they thought they were witnessing was now unfolding right in front of them. And Daniel turned slightly, his focus breaking for the first time, his certainty cracking just enough to let reality begin to seep in. And Ava, still on the ground, did not rush to stand, did not react with urgency, because she knew that the moment had already passed the point where control belonged to him. And as the suited figures moved closer, the space between perception and truth began to collapse, leaving only one question hanging silently in the air, not spoken, but felt by everyone watching. What exactly had just begun? The words settled into the air with a weight that no one could ignore, not because they were loud, but because of who spoke them and how they were delivered, calm, measured, absolute. And as the two men in dark suits stepped fully into view, the atmosphere shifted in a way that could be felt more than explained, like the moment before a storm breaks when everything goes still, and Daniel Hayes straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as his training took over, eyes narrowing slightly, as he assessed the new presence, searching for something familiar, something he could categorize, something that would allow him to regain control of the situation. But there was nothing about them that fit into the patterns he knew. No raised voices, no visible urgency, just quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And that was what made it unsettling. "This is an active situation," Daniel said, his voice firm but no longer as steady as before, the edge of certainty beginning to wear thin as he stepped half a pace forward, placing himself between Ava and the approaching men, a gesture meant to re-establish dominance, to remind everyone, including himself, that he was still the one in charge here. And yet, the lead agent did not slow, did not react, simply continued forward until the distance between them closed to just a few feet, his gaze level, unwavering. "Officer Hayes," he replied, acknowledging him with precision, not hostility, not deference, just recognition, and the use of his name again landed heavier this time. No longer a coincidence, no longer something easily dismissed, and Daniel felt it. The shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the ground beneath his certainty had begun to give way. "You are interfering with a federal operation," the agent continued, each word deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd disappeared completely, replaced by a silence so sharp it seemed to pull everyone closer, as if the truth itself demanded attention, and Daniel's jaw tightened as he processed the statement, his instincts pushing back, resisting, searching for a reason to challenge it, because accepting it meant acknowledging something he was not ready to face. "I have probable cause," he responded, the words coming out more rigid than before, more defensive, as if repeating procedure could anchor him to control. But the agent did not argue, did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket, every movement visible, intentional, removing a credential and holding it just enough for Daniel to see, not flashing it, not forcing it, simply presenting it as fact. And that was when the final layer began to fall away, because authority recognized authority, even when it did not want to, and Daniel's eyes flicked down for just a fraction of a second, long enough to register what he was looking at, long enough for doubt to turn into something heavier, something closer to realization. And behind him, Ava finally shifted, pushing herself up with controlled ease, not rushed, not shaken, her composure intact, as if the last several minutes had been nothing more than a calculated pause. And as she stood, brushing the dust from her sleeve with a simple, almost absent motion, the entire scene recalibrated around her, the center of gravity shifting without a single dramatic gesture, because real power rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself quietly, at the exact moment it needs to. And when she stepped forward, her presence alone carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, her gaze moving from the agent to Daniel, steady, unbroken. "I tried to tell you," she said, not as a reprimand, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And in that moment, The story everyone thought they were watching finally began to unravel, leaving behind only one truth that could no longer be ignored. For a moment, no one moved. Not the crowd, not the agents, not even the city itself, as if everything had been placed on hold waiting for one final confirmation, one undeniable truth to settle into place. And Daniel Hayes felt it before he fully understood it. That quiet collapse of certainty, the kind that does not happen all at once but instead unfolds in layers, each second peeling back another assumption he had built his authority on. And as Ava Carter stood there in front of him, no longer on the ground, no longer framed by the narrative he had forced onto her, something about the entire scene felt different, not louder, not more chaotic, but clearer, sharper, like a lens finally coming into focus. And the agent beside her did not need to say anything more because the silence itself was now doing the work, pressing in on Daniel from every direction, from the eyes of the crowd, from the stillness of the street, from the simple fact that no one was rushing to back him up anymore. No one was reinforcing his position, and that absence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. "Step back, officer," the agent said finally, not as a command meant to challenge him, but as a directive that assumed compliance. And that difference mattered, because it was no longer a negotiation, it was a transition, a shift of control that had already happened whether Daniel accepted it or not. And for the first time since this began, he hesitated, just slightly, just enough for everyone to see it. That flicker of uncertainty breaking through the surface. And if you were standing there watching, you would feel it too. That strange realization that the roles had reversed without anyone raising their voice, without any dramatic moment to mark it. Just a quiet, undeniable change in who held the weight of the situation. And Ava adjusted her jacket with a small, deliberate motion, her composure untouched, her breathing steady, as if she had been exactly where she needed to be the entire time. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different kind of authority now, not louder, not sharper, but grounded in something deeper, something that did not need to prove itself. "This area has been under active surveillance for the past 48 hours, she said, each word measured, precise, and your intervention compromised a controlled operation." And the statement landed heavily, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, that everything Daniel thought he was managing had already been part of something far beyond his awareness. And the crowd shifted again, not with curiosity this time, but with recognition, the kind that comes when a story stops being simple, when it no longer fits into easy assumptions. And Daniel swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, as he processed what that meant, not just for the moment, but for everything that would follow. The reports, the questions, the scrutiny, the realization that this was no longer a routine incident that would fade away by the end of his shift. And for the first time, his voice lowered, losing that earlier edge of certainty. "I was responding to a call," he said, as if explaining it might restore some balance, as if context could still justify his actions. But Ava's gaze did not waver, and the agent beside her remained still, neither interrupting nor correcting, because the truth did not need reinforcement anymore. It was already there, fully visible, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of another vehicle approaching blended into the background, a reminder that this moment was only the beginning of what would come next. And as the weight of it settled in, one thing became clear. To everyone watching, especially to Daniel himself, this was no longer his situation to control, and it never had been. The approaching vehicle did not rush, did not announce itself with urgency, but its presence carried a different kind of gravity, the kind that made people instinctively step aside before it even came to a full stop. And as it pulled up along the curb, the low hum of its engine seemed to settle into the silence that had already taken hold of the street, reinforcing what everyone was beginning to understand without needing it explained, that this moment was expanding, becoming something larger than a simple encounter, something that now involved layers no one had initially seen. And Daniel Hayes felt it more than anyone, that growing weight pressing in from all sides, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, as if the world around him was quietly reorganizing itself without asking for his permission. And when the rear door opened, another figure stepped out, composed, deliberate, dressed in the same understated authority as the others, the kind that did not seek attention but commanded it anyway, and Ava Carter's posture shifted just slightly, not in surprise, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement, the smallest indication that everything unfolding was exactly as it should be. And if you were standing there, watching from just a few feet away, you would notice that difference, that subtle alignment between her and the people now surrounding the scene. A connection that had never existed between her and the officer who had tried to define the situation just moments ago. And Daniel's eyes moved from one figure to the next, trying to recalibrate, trying to find footing in a moment that no longer followed the rules he understood. And for the first time, the question was not what he should do next, but whether anything he did would matter at all. "We are taking over from here," the newly arrived official said, his voice calm, steady, carrying the kind of finality that did not invite debate. And Daniel opened his mouth slightly, not to argue, not even to respond, but because the instinct to speak had not yet caught up with the realization that his role in this situation had already ended, and Ava took a single step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to shift the focus completely, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a presence that redefined the space itself. "This operation has been active across multiple locations," she said, her tone unchanged, precise, controlled, and any deviation, any interference, risks compromising months of coordinated work. And as she spoke, the weight of those words extended beyond Daniel, beyond the crowd, reaching into something much larger, something structured and deliberate, something that had been unfolding long before this moment and would continue long after it, and the people watching could feel it, even if they could not fully understand it, that sense that they were witnessing only a small piece of a much bigger picture. And Daniel lowered his gaze for a brief second, not out of submission, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when reality no longer aligns with expectation. And when he looked back up, the confidence that had once defined his stance was no longer there in the same way, replaced instead by a quieter awareness, one that acknowledged, without needing to say it out loud, that he had misread the situation from the very beginning. And Ava held his gaze for just a moment longer, not to challenge him, not to humiliate him, but to let the truth settle fully into place, because sometimes understanding does not come from confrontation, it comes from clarity, from the simple, undeniable realization that what you thought you controlled was never yours to begin with. And as the agents began to move around them, coordinating quietly, efficiently, restoring the structure that had been momentarily disrupted, the scene shifted once more, not back to what it had been, but forward into what it was always meant to become, leaving behind only the echo of a moment that had changed everything without ever raising its voice. The street no longer felt like a place of confusion or tension. It had become something else entirely, something structured, deliberate, almost surgical in the way every movement now had purpose. And as the agents continued to reposition themselves with quiet efficiency, the crowd that had once leaned in with curiosity began to pull back, not because they were told to, but because they could sense that whatever was happening no longer belonged to them, no longer something to watch casually, through a phone screen or whisper about in fragments. And Ava Carter stood at the center of it all, without raising her voice, without making a single dramatic gesture. Yet somehow everything now moved around her, aligned with her, responding to her presence in a way that could not be mistaken. And if you were still standing there, watching, you would begin to realize that power does not always look the way you expect it to. It does not always arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it reveals itself in stillness, in precision, in the quiet confidence of someone who has already seen 10 steps ahead. And Daniel Hayes felt that realization settle in deeper with every passing second, not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual understanding that replaced the certainty he once held. And as he glanced around, he noticed something he had not seen before, the way the agents communicated without words, subtle nods, brief eye contact, coordinated movements that suggested a system far more complex than anything he had initially walked into. And for the first time, he was not the one reading the situation, he was the one trying to catch up to it. "Perimeter is secure," one of the agents said quietly, not to Daniel, not to the crowd, but to Ava. And the way those words were directed made something else clear, something that no badge or uniform could redefine. And Ava gave a small nod. acknowledging the update with the kind of ease that comes from familiarity, not from authority being asserted, but from authority being understood. And she took a step forward, her gaze shifting briefly toward the direction of the black sedan before returning to the scene in front of her, calculating, assessing, confirming that the disruption had been contained, that the operation could continue, even if it had been momentarily exposed. And Daniel watched her, really watched her this time, not as a suspect, not as someone to control, but as someone he had completely misjudged from the very beginning. And that realization did not come with anger or defensiveness. It came with a quiet weight, the kind that sits heavy in your chest when you understand that a single moment, a single decision, has shifted everything that follows. And he exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously, as if releasing the last piece of the narrative he had tried to hold on to. And Ava noticed, not because she was looking for it, but because she noticed everything. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same calm precision. But now there was something else beneath it, something reflective, something that acknowledged the moment for what it was without needing to define it further. "This was never about you," she said, not dismissively, not coldly, but with a clarity that cut deeper than any accusation ever could. And the words settled between them, not as a confrontation, but as a truth, simple, direct, undeniable. And for Daniel, that was the moment it fully connected, that this entire situation, everything that had unfolded, had not been a challenge to his authority. It had been a reminder of its limits. And as the agents continued their work, restoring order with quiet precision, the scene no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like a continuation, a story moving forward exactly as it was meant to, leaving behind only the echo of a lesson that would not fade as easily as the crowd now slowly dispersing into the background. The last of the onlookers drifted further back now, their voices reduced to low murmurs that no longer shaped the moment, but simply reacted to it. And what remained in the space was something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that follows understanding rather than confusion. And Ava Carter stood still for a brief second longer, her eyes scanning the perimeter not out of tension but out of habit, confirming what she already sensed, that the disruption had been contained, that the variables were back under control. And only then did she shift her attention fully back to Daniel Hayes, who remained where he was, no longer at the center of anything, just present within a situation that had moved far beyond him. And if you looked closely, you could see it in the way he held himself now, not rigid, not commanding, but paused, as if recalibrating everything he thought he knew just minutes ago. And Ava took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to speak without raising her voice. "There are layers to this city you do not see from your patrol route," she said, her tone calm, not dismissive, but grounded in a reality he had just been forced to witness. And Daniel listened, not because he had to, but because there was nothing left to push against, nothing left to assert over. And for the first time, he understood that this was not about being corrected. It was about being confronted with a perspective he had never been required to consider. And Ava continued, her words steady, deliberate. "People move through it every day without realizing how much is happening around them. Decisions being made, operations unfolding, outcomes shaped long before they ever arrive at the surface." And as she spoke, the agents behind her continued their work with quiet precision, one speaking softly into a communication device, another reviewing something on a tablet, movements coordinated, efficient, seamless, reinforcing everything she was saying without needing to explain it further. And Daniel glanced briefly at them, then back at her, and something shifted again, not in the scene, but in him, a recognition that this moment was not just about a mistake. It was about the limits of his own perspective, the assumptions he carried into situations without questioning them. And Ava saw it, not because it was obvious, but because she had seen it before, in different forms, in different places, the moment when certainty gives way to understanding, and she did not press it, did not expand on it, because she did not need to. The lesson was already there, fully formed, and she stepped back slightly, allowing space to return to the moment, allowing him to process it without pressure. And in that space, Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge. "I did not know," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a simple acknowledgement. And Ava nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, not granting forgiveness, not offering judgment, just recognizing the truth in what he said. And for a second, everything felt still again, not tense, not uncertain, just resolved in a way that did not need to be announced. And somewhere behind them, the agents began to move out, their roles complete, their presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, leaving the street to return to itself, but not quite the same as before, because moments like this do not disappear completely. They linger, they reshape, they leave something behind in the people who experience them. And as Ave turned slightly, preparing to step back into the operation that had only paused, not stopped, one final realization settled into place, not spoken, not emphasized, but clear to anyone who had truly been paying attention. That power is not proven in the moment you take control, it is revealed in the moment you never needed to. The street slowly returned to its rhythm, the distant hum of traffic rising again, footsteps blending into the background, conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different in a way that could not be seen but could be felt, like a quiet shift beneath the surface that only those who had witnessed the moment would carry with them. And Ava Carter walked toward the waiting vehicle without urgency, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if she were simply continuing something that had never truly been interrupted, and the agents around her moved in sync, not drawing attention, not creating a scene, just restoring the natural flow of a system that operated far beyond what most people ever noticed. And as she reached the edge of the sidewalk, she paused for a brief second, not because she needed to, but because something behind her still lingered, something unfinished. And without turning fully, she glanced back just enough to meet Daniel Hayes's eyes one last time. And in that glance, there was no anger, no triumph, no need to prove anything, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them, a moment that neither of them could undo, but both of them would carry forward in very different ways. And Daniel stood where he was, the weight of the situation settling into something deeper than embarrassment or regret, something closer to awareness, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends, the kind that stays with you, reshaping how you see the next situation, the next person, the next decision. And if you could step into his mind for just a second, you would realize that this was not about losing control. It was about understanding that control was never as absolute as he believed, that authority without awareness is fragile, and that the world is far more complex than the narrow lens he had been operating through. And Ava held that gaze for just a fraction longer before turning away completely, stepping into the vehicle as the door closed with a soft, definitive sound. And as the car pulled away, merging seamlessly into the flow of the city, it left behind no spectacle, no lingering noise, just the echo of a moment that had quietly redefined everything it touched. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal that something inside him had shifted, not broken, not defeated, but changed. And around him, the street looked the same, the buildings unchanged, the sunlight still casting long shadows across the pavement. But the way he saw it was no longer the same, and that was the difference that mattered. Because sometimes the most powerful consequences are not loud, they do not come with immediate punishment or visible outcomes. Sometimes they arrive in silence, in reflection, in the realization that the next time you step into a situation, you will not be the same person who walked into the last one. And as Daniel finally turned to leave, blending back into the routine he had always known, one thought lingered, clear and unshakable, not spoken, not written, but deeply understood. That day he did not just encounter someone he misjudged, he encountered the limits of his own perspective, and that kind of lesson does not fade. It stays, it grows, it waits, until the next moment when it matters most. Because the truth is, he thought he was the law, but that day, the law had a different face.